What's going on, Skullbrains? Welcome to another episode of Skullbrain TV, and in this episode, let's see if Richard and his companions can escape the evil grip of Klaw in the next episode of The Ancestral Trail.
When he, who is the Chosen One, shall tread upon the ancient path, and battle there to overcome
the forces of the dark.
The Ancestral Trail, an epic story of myths, magic, and monsters. Book 12, Scorpions of the Desert, Deadly Gods of the Sandy Fortress.
That's right, in the last episode, Richard and his friends rescued another guardian from the ancestral world, but were then faced by the evil Klaw and his army of bonemen. In mid-battle, Kika the Guardian flies off with Orkin's weapons, leaving them stranded. So let's see how this turns out. But before we do, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody that's been leaving comments and giving me feedback on these videos. It's getting a great response, and it's really good to see that people are enjoying what I'm creating. Even Frank Graves, the creator of this series, has reached out to let me know how much he's enjoying them, so thank you very much. It really does mean a lot to hear all of your thoughts, so please feel free to leave comments and give me some feedback. So, let's get into this episode. But before we do, have you seen the Ancestral Challenge for this week? If not, you can check it out here. Come on back, and let's get this party started. You ready? Let's do this.
On the 12th day, Mirage City in the sand, out of sight but close at hand, hides the fairest in the land. Corridors of staring eyes in streets of half-forgotten sighs led them to the golden prize. Travelers fight pensive might, cobras keep a dark surprise.
Never had Richard seen such rage. As he and his companions stood by the bone man, Klaw's fury at losing Kika was plain. Even so, the snake-like speed of Klaw's hand took Richard by surprise. A skeletal fist gripped his neck, and for a second, he stared into dark, cavernous eyes. Then he was dropped onto the rocks alongside Orkin and Melik. "So, it is the Chosen One," Klaw snapped at Richard. "Maybe the day hasn't been wasted after all." The three companions watched in terror as Klaw grabbed a huge double-headed battle axe from one of his bone warriors. He swung it back in preparation for the death sweep. This time, there was no escape. As the mighty axe started forward, Richard heard a high, fluting sound in the air. It grew louder and louder, and then there was a violent thud, part crunch, part squelch, as if someone had trodden on an enormous beetle. A look of astonishment passed over Klaw's face. Then the axe fell from his hands. He stood swaying for a few seconds before toppling into the sand. From his chest stuck the feathered shaft of the arrow Kika had taken from Orkin's quiver. The arrow had pierced Klaw's bony armor and plunged deep into the rotting mass that had once been his heart. An evil-smelling yellow ooze was seeping up and out of the wound. The companions breathed a sigh of relief. It took them a few moments to realize that Klaw's bone warriors, with their leader dead, had disintegrated in lifeless heaps around them. Kika landed neatly among the bones.
"Here's your bow, Orkin,"
the Guardian said.
"It served us well."
Orkin's jaw fell open as he numbly accepted the bow. "We thought you'd run off and left us," Richard blurted out in bewilderment and gratitude.
I had to get to the mountains to find the potion I needed.
Kika smiled.
There is a rare bush whose berries contain the only poison capable of killing Klaw. I smeared some over Orkin's arrow and came back as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to tend my leg, but I did get what I needed for it.
Kika produced a handful of herbs and berries and mixed them into a poultice. She slapped the sticky mess onto her wound. The effect was instantaneous.
That's better,
She sighed.
There's just one more thing to do before we set off for Sand City.
Wrinkling her nose against the stench, Kika began to search Klaw's corpse for the weapons he had stolen from her. At last she found them, a finely wrought blowpipe and a bundle of needle-sharp darts.
Right, let's go,
Kika said. The others fell into line behind the Guardian and moved off across the expanse of sand. "Ooh, it's getting chilly," Richard muttered, pulling his collar up as a cold wind snickered around his neck. "I thought deserts were meant to be warm." Kika sniffed the air and caught a dry whiff of electricity combined with the sharp odor of burned stone.
I think there's going to be a storm. I can smell it coming.
The light began to fade. The wind rose and specks of dark sand flicked painfully against their skin. The four of them struggled on through increasingly poor visibility. Before long, the wind had risen to a shriek. It was no longer specks that struck them, but an unceasing shower of sand that whipped horizontally, blasting its way across the desert. The four protected themselves as much as possible, but they were ill-equipped to meet the drilling impact of the storm.
This is going to be worse than I thought. Keep your faces down and your mouths shut,
Kika ordered.
Whatever you do, don't look straight into the wind. This stuff can scour your eyeballs in seconds.
Peering down at the ground, their faces covered, they shuffled along in single file, one hand resting on the back of the person in front to avoid losing contact. Richard reflected grimly that they must look just like a band of lepers from the Middle Ages, blind, ragged, and helpless. The storm blew unevenly. One minute it raged with all its might, hiding everything from sight. The next minute it abated into sweeping curtains of sand, through which it was just possible to make out the way ahead. It was during one of these lulls that Richard caught the first sight of their destination. Up until now, the only view that the travellers had been able to make out from each ridgetop was of further ridgetops shimmering across the desert in endless waves. Then suddenly, as they topped one slope, the storm died down, and the scenery changed. Ahead, blurry in the haze, rose a mass of yellow sand-coloured buildings surrounded by a high wall.
Sand City,
Kika said. "How come we didn't see the city before?" Richard asked in confusion. "Surely we'd have seen something this big, even with the sandstorm." "Well, maybe it's a mirage," Melik piped up knowingly.
No, what you saw before, all those ridges going off into the distance, was the mirage,
Kika explained.
Sand City has been here all the time. Good camouflage, isn't it?
"Well, we'd never have found it on our own," Richard said. "It's lucky we had you to guide us." Now, as they approached their goal, the landscape worked in their favour. Only when they crossed the top of a ridge did they have to bother with concealment. Otherwise, they walked fast and free in the shelter of the gullies. Soon the land began to flatten into a wide, featureless expanse that surrounded Sand City on every side. Standing on a rocky outcrop on one of the last ridges, the tired travellers surveyed the walls with dismay. They were high, windowless, and accessible only through a single arched gateway. Worse still, the gateway was guarded. "We'll never get past those," Richard said, horrified by the 6 creatures that stood unmoving before the gate. "They're scorpion guards," Kika said. Richard peered at the creatures. They were like the scorpions he had seen in books, but larger. Much larger. Their narrow, blue-black bodies curved back to a fiercely barbed tail. Only their eyes were different, glowing a deep, murderous red inside shrouded sockets. Suddenly, the guards changed formation, moving across the sand in a complicated maneuver. From where he stood, Richard could hear the skittering tick-tick-tick of their claws on the ground. It was a cold, precise sound that struck a chill deep in his heart.
Wait here,
Kika whispered.
I'll see if I can find another way in.
The Guardian flew off, skimming along the contours of the land until she had circled out of the guard's line of sight. She swooped up and round the city walls, scanning every inch for a way in. Then she saw a section where the walls had toppled outwards in a jumbled splay of sandstone. The trio would be able to climb over the rubble and into the city. She flew back and told Richard. The small party moved off, taking care not to alert the Scorpion guards. Before long, the whole group was peering over a sandy ridge directly opposite the broken wall.
Looks perfect, Richard whispered. Were there any scorpions inside? None that I could see, Kika replied. You go on ahead, and I'll keep watch.
Richard went first, running in a crouch over the flat sand until he reached the pile of sandstone. He turned to give a thumbs-up sign, then scrambled into the city. Melik followed. It came to Orkin's turn. He looked up to where Kika was hovering in the air, ready to warn of oncoming scorpions. She signalled the all clear, and he sprang out of cover, running full tilt for the wall. Orkin was halfway to safety when the sound of scuttling scorpion feet carried clearly through the dry atmosphere. Orkin saw the scorpion at the same time as the scorpion saw him. He put on an extra burst of speed and reached the sandstone rubble. Faster, Orkin, Richard shouted encouragement. It did no good. The guard was faster. The scorpion's tail rose up and stabbed vengefully into Orkin's thigh. Orkin yelled in pain and slashed out with his sword, slicing into the offending tail as it rhythmically pumped its poison into him. As he pulled himself to safety, Orkin wrenched the sting, still pulsing a greenish juice, from his flesh and flung it to one side. Richard and Melik rushed over to help their wounded companion. The only way forward was up some steps. By the time they reached the top, Orkin was feeling dizzy. His limbs were becoming numb. He could feel himself losing consciousness. The last thing he saw was a flurry of wings. From far off, he could hear Kika's voice.
Don't worry,
the voice was reassuring.
You'll be all right.
Then Orkin blacked out.
Richard, lance the wound,
Kika commanded.
We've got to get the poison out. I've still got some herbs and berries. I can save him.
Drawing the dagger which Jarut had given him, Richard sliced through the swelling in Orkin's thigh. As the skin split, a thick, evil-smelling liquid gushed out, spilling onto Orkin's leg. Kika quickly wiped away the ooze and applied a poultice to the open wound.
He'll come round in a few minutes, Kika said. There's nothing to worry about now.
Well, let's look at the Book of Prophecies and check the Pathfinder while we're waiting, Richard suggested. Melik took out the instrument and handed it to Richard. As Melik began to read aloud, Richard pointed the instrument towards a nearby tower. The tip of the arrow began to glow golden. The pod's in there, Richard murmured. It must be Cobra's Keep. I don't like the sound of the corridors of eyes. We must take extra care. As Richard finished, they heard a gruff rumbling near their feet. Orkin was coming round. He was a bit shaky, but otherwise, all right. Come on, Richard said. Let's get to Cobra's Keep and get the pod. The sandstorm was now blowing with renewed vigour. The companions adjusted their clothes against the stinging bursts and set off through the winding streets towards Cobra's Keep. The houses either side looked long since deserted. Shutters flapped wearily from their hinges, and now and then the four heard ominous slithering sounds. They moved in fits and starts through the winding passages, fitting their speed to the storm's force. When it blew strongest, they shrank into their clothes and crept along like cautious tortoises. When it lessened a little, they loosened themselves, lengthened their stride, and made good progress. Finally, the companions emerged on a wide thoroughfare. So far, there had been no sign of any scorpions. Richard looked down the street, checking either side for signs of movement. He took one step forward and then stopped dead. He heard the familiar tick-tick-ticking sound from his left, then from his right. Then, from behind him, came a fast staccato rattle, as if a whole platoon of scorpions were moving in. "Run!" Richard shouted. Hardly had the word left his lips when a scorpion stepped out right in front of them. As if on cue, the sound of scorpion claws clattered out on all sides. Richard, Kika, and Orkin drew their weapons and prepared to make a stand. Out of the billowing clouds of sand emerged evil, black pincered shapes, red eyes glowing, and tails poised ready to strike. The four travellers were surrounded. Kika moved fast and purposefully. Before the others had so much as taken a step towards their foe, she had her blowpipe to her lips and was spraying a lethal fan of darts at the enemies.
Aim for the eyes,
She shouted, reloading her blowpipe.
that's their vulnerable spot.
Another rain of darts spat out at the scorpions. This time it was joined by a slender stream of arrows, as Orkin pulled and re-pulled his bow with lightning speed. There were too many scorpions, and they were closing too quickly. Pincer jaws snapped in vicious unison as the squad moved in. Orkin discarded his bow and jumped out with his sword, stabbing left and right with well-aimed blows. Richard leaped after him with Jarut's dagger, dodging under the scorpion's jagged clawed swipes. For a while, the two companions did well, plunging their weapons into the scorpion guard's body armor and killing them with a single thrust to the eye. Having 2 legs instead of 6 became an advantage in this close-quarters combat. And Richard found that he could swerve and slide through the scorpion's defenses with relative ease. Melik and Kika did their best to help, but they were not equipped for the kind of hand-to-hand fighting needed now. Kika hovered in the air and used her blowpipe whenever she could. Melik ran to and fro, trying to dodge the scorpion's tails. As Richard and Orkin slashed their way into the blue-black ranks, a thin scream filled the air. All 3 fighters looked in Kika's direction at once. The Guardian was thrashing feebly in the air, caught in the grip of a scorpion bigger than any Richard had seen so far.
Help!
Kika screamed. The scorpion's red eyes glowed malevolently. Then his pincer closed, tighter and tighter. And that is the end of book number 12. So, how did you go with the Ancestral Challenge? Were you able to find all of the hidden objects? And who do you think the scorpions were based on from Morbane's book of Magic and Monsters? In the pinned comment below, you can find a link where you can download the map pieces that came with this issue. And don't forget to head over to Instagram and follow @Skullbrain Inc. if you'd like to get the Ancestral Challenge a day early. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and ring the little bell icon to be notified when the next episode is released. Thanks again for watching this episode of The Ancestral Trail. I look forward to seeing you next week. And until then, stay tuned and stay skull-brained.